Benenson explained that any Clinton opponent who stole this data would surely have realized that the best way to counter the plan was to bombard those voters with negative information about Clinton. All they need to do is keep that person where they are, he said, which is far easier than persuading a voter to switch candidates. Many critics have accused Clinton of taking Michigan and Wisconsin for granted and spending virtually no time there. But Benenson said that, if a covert social media campaign targeting Hillary defectors was indeed launched in battleground states, it might well have changed the outcome of the election. Benenson said, "We lost Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, 3 states of our blue wall, by about 80,000 votes. 660,000 votes were cast in those 3 states for third-party candidates. Winning those 3 states would have got us to 278 electoral votes. In other words, if only 12% of those third-party voters were persuaded by Russian propaganda, based on hacked Clinton campaign analytics, not to vote for Clinton, then Jameson's theory could be valid." Benenson said that, when he first learned about the theft, he called another consultant on the campaign and said, "This is unreal." The consultant reminded him that, in focus groups with undecided voters in the fall of 2016, would hear these things like, "I really hate Trump, but Hillary's going to murder all these people," all sorts of crazy stuff. Benenson admitted that many Americans had long disliked the Clintons, and had for years spread exaggerated rumors of their alleged misdeeds and deceptions. But he wonders if some of those conspiracy-minded voters hadn't been unknowingly influenced by Russian propagandists who were marshalling the Clinton campaign's own analytics. Philip Howard, the director of the Oxford Internet Institute, in England, agrees that the Russian interference could have been decisive, but he is less convinced that the stolen analytics were key. He told me, "It's plausible, but the Russians wouldn't have needed the Clinton campaign. They could just as easily have targeted the network of Bernie Sanders supporters." Did we make mistakes? Benenson asked about the Clinton campaign's performance. "Sure. But," he said, he believes that Russian interference in the 2016 election was the biggest threat to democracy we've ever had in this country, other than the wars we've had to fight. Jameson has long been respected by the Washington media establishment, but it's a safe bet that the Trump White House will dismiss her work as more fake news. A senior Trump advisor who was involved in the 2016 campaign, and has yet to see Jameson's book, recently sent me a text. "Where is the evidence? And when do people start to feel ashamed that they can't accept the election results and the crappy candidate they ran?" Quote, "Other academics may also be skeptical of cyberwar. A forthcoming book on the 2016 campaign, Identity Crisis, by the political scientists John Sides, Michael Tesler, and Lynn Vavreck, argues that Russian interference was not a major factor in the presidential election, and that the hacked emails did not clearly affect perceptions of Clinton. Instead, they write, Trump's exploitation of divisive race, gender, religious, and ethnicity issues accounted for his win." But the two books are not necessarily incompatible. Jameson shows that Russian saboteurs inflamed polarizing identity issues, including resentment among whites that minority groups were benefiting at the expense of real Americans, which is exactly what Identity Crisis says swung the election. Recently, Brendan Nyhan, a professor of public policy at the University of Michigan, suggested, in the Times, that most fears about the impact of Russian information warfare in the 2016 campaign are exaggerated. He wrote that, a growing number of studies conclude that most forms of political persuasion seem to have little effect at all, and cited studies suggesting that television ads, direct mail, and door-to-door canvassing rarely sway voters. Moreover, he argued, though the number of Russian-sponsored messages during the 2016 campaign might sound alarmingly large, the universe of information that most voters are exposed to is so vast that the impact of fake news, and other malicious online misinformation, is diluted. He noted, Twitter, for instance, reported that Russian bots tweeted 2.1 million times before the election, certainly a worrisome number. But these represented only 1% of all election-related tweets and 0.5% of views of election-related tweets. He concluded, it's hard to change people's minds. Quote, conservative news outlets like the Daily Caller have embraced the view that Russia's social media operations were negligible. But Jonathan Albright, of Columbia University's Tow Center for Digital Journalism, who has been at the forefront of documenting the spread of online disinformation from Russia and other sources, describes the drop-in-the-bucket argument as a case of false framing. He told me, a better way to think if it is not as a drop of solution but as pollution. Every piece of messaging has some effect. It's misleading, he says, to focus only on the relatively small number of obvious propaganda messages, such as paid Facebook ads. Far more important, in the 2016 campaign, was organic content. The countless messages created by masked Russian social media accounts that were spread by algorithms, bots, and unwitting American users. The reach of such content, he told me, turned out to be huge. Of the 470 Facebook accounts known to have been created by Russian saboteurs during the campaign, a mere 6 of them generated content that was shared at least 340 million times. The Facebook page for a fake group, Blacktivist, which stoked racial tensions by posting militant slogans and stomach-churning videos of police violence against African Americans, garnered more hits than the Facebook page for Black Lives Matter. The Blacktivist ruse was part of a larger Russian plot to divide Americans, according to Senator Mark Warner, the vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. An expert told the committee that automated accounts typically push extremist views 25 to 30 times more often than authentic American social media users do. It blew my mind, he told me. It was an OMG moment. The extremes are screaming while the majority whispers. It is now understood that Russia's influence was far larger than social media companies originally acknowledged. Facebook initially claimed that Russian disinformation posted during the campaign had likely reached only 10 million Facebook users. It subsequently amended the figure to 126 million. Twitter recently acknowledged that it, too, was deeply infiltrated, hosting more than 50,000 imposter accounts. James Clapper told me, it's hard to convey to people how massive an assault this was, and added, I think the Russians have more to do with making Clinton lose than Trump did. Yet he remains cautious about saying that this is provable. So does Albright, of the Tow Center. He has accumulated a huge quantity of data documenting Russian meddling, but he believes that it remains difficult to quantify what the impact was on the outcome. He told me that Russian interference provoked outrage, created discontent with social systems such as police and safety, pushed certain RBAN and disadvantaged communities to feel marginalized, and amplified wedge issues beyond authentic reach through social media, which then magnified media coverage of certain issues. He went on, that's an impact. But to translate that into voting patterns is very difficult. Michael Hayden, the former director of the CIA and the NSA, is also agnostic. He has called the Russian attacks the most successful covert influence operation in history, but concludes that, although Russian hackers may have, as he put it, put the thumb on the American electoral scale, there's simply no telling the impact. It's not just unknown, it's unknowable. Jameson quotes Hayden making this argument, but writes that she must respectfully disagree. Cyberwar doesn't simply document Russia's hacking and social media campaigns. It also pinpoints another, less well-known, instance of Russian sabotage, and Jameson argues that this dirty trick, in combination with the actions of trolls and hackers, may have changed the course of the 2016 campaign. In her telling, James Comey's decision to issue a series of damaging public pronouncements on Clinton's handling of classified emails can plausibly be attributed to Russian disinformation. As evidence, Jameson cites Comey's own story, told in interviews and in his recent memoir, of what happened behind the scenes. Jameson became curious as she watched Comey, on July 5, 2016, make the first of 3 public statements during the campaign about emails that Clinton had mishandled while serving as Obama's Secretary of State. At a press conference, Comey announced his intention to recommend that the Justice Department not charge Clinton. But first he denounced her actions as extremely careless. Jameson recalls wondering, why are you doing this? She told me, it was odd. Ordinarily, when the FBI ends an investigation with no charges, it says nothing. In very high-profile cases, it sometimes issues a declination statement. But even though Comey wasn't the head of the Justice Department, he was only the FBI director. He had unilaterally designated himself the spokesman for the entire investigation, and had called a live press conference without asking the permission of his boss, Attorney General Loretta Lynch. As Jameson worked on her manuscript, she noticed that Comey repeatedly hinted that his decision to preempt his boss was prompted, in part, by classified information, which, if leaked, would undermine the overall integrity of the Clinton probe. In public, he mysteriously declined to be more specific about this intelligence, but claimed that it had compounded concerns already stirred by an impromptu private visit between Lynch and Bill Clinton on June 27, at an Arizona airport. 6 months after the election, the Washington Post broke a story that solved the mystery. At some point in 2016, the FBI had received unverified Russian intelligence describing purported emails from Lynch to a member of the Clinton team in which she promised that she'd go easy on Clinton. An unnamed source told the Post that the intelligence had been viewed as junk. Nonetheless, Comey has reportedly told aides that he let the disinformation shape his decision to sideline Lynch. Fearing, in part, that conservatives would create a furor if the alleged emails became public, he began to feel that Lynch could not credibly participate in announcing a declination. A subsequent report by the Justice Department's Inspector General described Comey's behavior as extraordinary and insubordinate, and found his justifications unpersuasive. Nick Merrill, a former Clinton campaign spokesman, describes Comey's actions as mind-blowing. He said of the intelligence impugning Lynch, "It was a Russian forgery." But Comey based major decisions in the Justice Department on Russian disinformation because of the optics of it. The Russians targeted the FBI, hoping they'd act on it, and then he went ahead and did so. In the fake Russian intelligence, one of the Clinton campaign officials accused of conspiring with Lynch was Amanda Renteria. She was shocked to learn of the allegations, and told me that, although she is friendly with a woman named Loretta Lynch, a political figure in California, she does not know the Loretta Lynch who was the Attorney General. Renteria said, "To me, it says that, in the new world of politics, even if something isn't real, it can still move things. You aren't living in the world of reality anymore." Comey declined to comment for this article, citing the classified nature of the intelligence in question. As with the other incidents described in Jameson's book, it is hard to assess precisely how much of a difference his damaging statements about Clinton made at the voting booth. But it certainly didn't help her candidacy when, just 10 days before the election, Comey, reprising his self-appointed spokesperson role, announced that the FBI was reopening the investigation because more Clinton emails had been found. 7 days later, he made a third announcement, clearing her again. Adam Schiff, the Democratic representative who is the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, told me that, if you take Comey at his word that the fake intelligence drove his decision to publicly censor Clinton in the first place, there are skeptics who suspect that Comey's grandstanding moralism as a bigger factor, then it probably was the most measurable and the most significant way in which the Russians may have impacted the outcome of the election. Polls suggest the likely impact. According to the website 538, at midnight on October 28, 2016, the day Comey announced that he was reopening the investigation, Clinton was ahead of Trump by 5.9%. A week later, her lead had shrunk to 2.9%. Nate Silver, the founder of 538, has noted that, during this time, coverage of the Clinton email investigation dominated the news, drowning out other headlines. According to researchers at Microsoft, the Times ran as many front-page stories on the emails that week as it ran front-page stories about the candidates' policy proposals in the final few months of the campaign. Silver concluded that all the talk about Clinton's emails may have shifted the race by as much as 4 points, swinging Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Florida to Trump, and possibly North Carolina and Arizona, too. Jameson, ever the social scientist, emphasizes in her book that there is much that Americans still don't know about the campaign, including the detailed targeting information that would clarify exactly whom the Russian disinformation was aimed at, and when it was sent. She told me, "We need to know the extent to which the Russians targeted the 3 key states, and which citizens' voting patterns differed substantially from the ones you would have predicted in the past." Philip Howard, the Oxford professor, believes that Facebook possesses this data, down to the location of a user's computer, and that such information could conceivably reveal whether an undecided voter was swayed after viewing certain content. He also thinks that, if there was any collusion between the St. Petersburg trolls and the Trump campaign, Facebook's internal data could document it by revealing coordination on political posts. But, he says, Facebook has so far resisted divulging such data to researchers, claiming that doing so would be a breach of its user agreement. Even if this targeting information were released, though, questions would remain. Jameson notes that post-election interviews are often unhelpful, since few voters are able to accurately recount what influenced the decision. Scholars know even less about non-voters. As a result, she writes in Cyberwar, efforts to make an ironclad case will be thwarted by unknowns. Nevertheless, her book concludes that Russian trolls and hackers helped elect a U.S. president. Jameson told me that one of her greatest concerns is that voters were unaware of the foreign effort to manipulate them on social media. Had the public known, she believes, there likely would have been a significant backlash. We want voters to be aware of who is trying to influence them, she said. That's the reason we have disclosure requirements on our campaign ads. We've known, at least since Aristotle in Western culture, that the source is judged as part of the message. Americans eager to declare Trump's election illegitimate will be disappointed by one of Jameson's arguments. Regardless of her findings about the Russian scheme, she writes that, barring evidence of tampering with voting machines or ballot boxes, Trump is the duly elected President of the United States. She says that she will leave it to others to decide whether Trump should remain in office if conclusive evidence emerges that he colluded with the Kremlin in order to win the election. My personal judgment is yes, even then Mr. Trump would be president, she writes. But probably not for long. Diamond Suit. Jane Mayer has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 1995. Read more. Jane Mayer has been a staff writer at The